Yeah.
Well, welcome everybody. Taking pictures, my goodness. Yeah, I guess it's social media. Thank you for coming. You guys have been doing a lot of work, moving from room to room and hearing.
Yeah, get it up.
All right, we'll try and move it up. It's kind of under my chin already, though.
Yeah.
Any better?
I'll get you. Try that.
How's that? Is it working better? All right, thank you. Thank you, David. I knew I wanted a sailor on this talk because he can fix things at a moment's notice. Well, thanks for being here. We are going to be thinking about connections this hour between vulnerable places and populations and the work that you do with Citizens Climate Lobby. I want you to raise your hands if you first got concerned about climate change from watching An Inconvenient Truth. How many? It's part of it? That's part of influence? Well, it's certainly true for me. That was a big one. And at the time, I was doing watershed work in the San Francisco Bay Area. We were doing things like wetland restoration, native oyster restoration in the bay. And I realized after watching the movie that because of climate change and ocean acidification, a lot of our work was going to be useless. And those populations and what we were trying to preserve couldn't be preserved unless something else happened in the meantime. So a year and a half ago, I left my job. I started working for Natural Resources Defense Council, teaching them to use CCL methods with their membership in support of the Clean Power Plan. And it worked. CCL methods are terrific, as you know. And then after doing that pilot for NRDC, I started the Business Climate Leaders, which is an initiative. Let me get this thing over here. Business Climate Leaders, which is a CCL project, and our goal is to recruit businesses to work with you when you're lobbying. In other words, if you go into a lobby meeting and you have a business representative with you to say, we want a price on carbon, it makes your voice that much more powerful. These are some of the companies that we've recruited. And if you want to find out more about working with businesses and CCL, we have a breakout in the last session of the day. It's called Engaging Business in Climate Advocacy. So if you would like to find out more or help us engage businesses, show up there and you will find out more. Oops, wrong way. So, life after fee and dividend. What's next for CCL? Let's pretend, just for a minute, that Congress has just passed a fee and dividend bill. Can you dig it? Would that be cool? Okay, it just happened. What's next for Citizens Climate Lobby? What do we do then? Are we done? What are you going to do next?
It's only beginning.
Yeah. So, and specifically, what about the most vulnerable? Like those native oysters or like the wetlands, what's going to happen? CCL's mission, if you recall, is the political will for a livable planet. What does that mean? What does livable mean? Is 2 degrees of warming going to be livable?
No.
How about 1.5 degrees? Is that going to be livable? I mean, here we are today, it's 1 degree, right? We're at about 1 degree, and things are kind of going haywire. 1 degree is not going to be livable either, and what we really want is we want to get to 0 degrees. The problem is, it's going to take a while. What do we have to do? We have to fix the planet's carbon cycle, which we've been tampering with, right? We've been putting all this extra carbon into the atmosphere. We've got to stop doing that. Is that going to be enough? It's not going to be enough because that carbon is up there for a long time. That means we have to repair the carbon sinks, the forests, the wetlands, the grasslands, the things that have been pulling out carbon from the atmosphere in a natural carbon cycle, and we have degraded them. So that's another thing that we have to do. Unfortunately, that is going to take a while. So what is going to happen to the most vulnerable places and populations in the meantime? Fee and dividend will take a while to kick in. Repairing the sinks will take even longer. While we work to restore the carbon cycle, we have got to figure out what to do to protect those precious places and populations that are most vulnerable. So we're going to discuss a few of those places and populations and what we can do in the meantime. And to help us with that, I'm really pleased to have some people who are really good at doing special things. And let's go through these guys. We'll do the introductions first, and then they get to talk to you. And then you get to ask them questions. David Thoreson. This is David. Professional photographer, sailor, and explorer extraordinaire. David was the first American to sail the Arctic's Northwest Passage in both directions. I didn't even know you could do it in one. David's work has appeared across a broad spectrum of media, from the Smithsonian to The Guardian, PBS, done a TED Talk. He is an Explorers Club Fellow and a participant in the just held 2016 Nobel Peace Prize Forum. His personal climate story is documented in a new book that's coming out, Over the Horizon, Exploring the Edges of a Changing Planet. David's work has given him a unique first-hand experience of what's happening in the Arctic, and he's going to talk today on behalf of the Alaska Wilderness League. To make that even better, we don't have Matt Anderson today, because Matt had an unfortunate family incident and can't join us, but instead, we have the Alaska Wilderness League itself. This is Leah Donahue, who's in charge of one of their most important campaigns, and will be filling in some blanks. And Leah, when we get to you, you can do an introduction, and I'll give you the mic. Great. And our third panelist, Sean Powers, is with Earth Rights International. Sean's a graduate of the NYU School of Law. He's a litigator, and he's been with Earth Rights International since early 2014. Now, you might be wondering, what is the connection here? And it's really fascinating. It's going to be a lot of fun to learn out what this kind of work means for the most vulnerable places and populations. He began in ERI's Southeast Asia office, where he worked on behalf of Mekong Delta communities impacted by hydropower and mining projects. He later joined the DC office here, where he's been involved in human rights litigation against major U.S. companies and international financial institutions. Sean is now responsible for developing ERI's emerging climate accountability strategy. Remember those two words, climate accountability. We're going to be talking a lot about that. So those are the introductions. Now it's David's turn. Now I'm going to get this thing off. He's going to jury rig himself. Why don't you un-jury rig me? Because you can see what I'm doing.
That's true.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you very much, Harold. I'll jury rig myself. I'm not sure I've ever done that before.
But he's a sailor.
That's a new term. So let's see, a little presto changeo here, and take you off the screen. Okay, we'll get this up and go from the beginning. Awesome. So my name's David Thoreson, and I'm just very, very honored to be here with all of you today. Foot soldiers on the ground, boots on the ground, folks who, just like me, are out there trying to do what we can to make this a more livable planet, sustainable planet for future generations. And my role has been to go out into the world and gather information and ground truth what the scientists have been telling us for some 2 decades now. My sailing career began literally about 25 years ago, and I'm going to run through some of this quickly, and then I'll be very anxious to answer any question you may throw at me. So think about this as we're running through. This is one of my favorite photographs from the Arctic Ocean. But my story does not begin in the Arctic Ocean, because I'm a sailor from Iowa, as a matter of fact. And this is where I cut my teeth on the water on this beautiful little glacial lake in northwest Iowa that was created by a changing climate some 14,000 years ago by the receding glaciers, of course, in the more natural slow cycle, not this new forced cycle that's been created by human emissions. So my story begins here, and it happens to begin in Senator Steve King, or Representative Steve King's district. where I will be lobbying tomorrow with the Citizens Climate Lobby. So this is a great place to begin my climate story. Right, Steve King's district. And so I learned to sail on this lake. This is me at the tiller there with my mom, who was quite a sailor in her day, and my grandfather was also a sailor. You can see the name of my boat on the stern. It was called Help Upside Down, just in case I needed it. Now, my pathway to the sea was not sort of a direct path. You know, you might say, how do you get from Iowa to the ocean? Well, for me it was easy. I met a southern Minnesota hog farmer, and the rest was history. So together we went off and sailed the world's oceans, and I sailed over 40,000 miles with Roger, who is he's passed away now, but he was selected as America's finest offshore voyager of the past 3 decades, so quite a mentor indeed. Roger introduced me to the greater, bigger elements that comprise the Earth's weather systems, which then go on to comprise the entire Earth's climate systems. And out there on the world's oceans, you get a real taste for the elements. You can't get out of them, and you have a long time to think about that on late night watches, like here in Antarctica, sailing through the snow. But it was in these special places, sailing through mountainous waves and to the polar areas of the Earth, that I started formulating my thoughts on this whole climate science. How does it work? Because if you think about it, back in the early 90s, nobody was really talking about this concept of climate change. It's kind of crept into our consciousness over time. At the very beginning of this era, it was only the scientists who were talking about it. Now here we are in this room, all of us are understanding how all the pieces work together. And here in these special places, like sitting in the harbor down in Antarctica, after getting kicked around in a storm for days and days that we thought we wouldn't get out of, it all started making sense to me that in these hugely powerful systems of the Earth, in these polar places, you find that there's delicately balanced systems where minute changes affect these polar areas more than others. And I'll get to the Arctic in a second, but these are Adelie penguins along the Antarctic Peninsula, and they are now very much threatened by climate change along the peninsula, which is warming at a very accelerated rate, just like the Arctic is. But my story really comes to life here in the Northwest Passage. And 22 years ago, right at this time, I was headed north. And you can see right over here, we left from the east side of the Northwest Passage and proceeded up the west coast of Greenland. We met Raoul Damusen's route, and then the route goes over the top of the entire continent of North America, over the top of our Arctic in Alaska, down through the Bering Strait, and eventually into the Pacific. It had never been done before by any American sailor, so in 1994, we took off to the Northwest Passage. So the route, I'll make this short because there's a long story here, and I'm happy to answer any questions later. But this is the entrance to the Northwest Passage. So you go up the west coast of Greenland with the receding ice, into the Canadian archipelago of islands. And you're in these powerful weather systems and powerful history, as we discovered at the graves of the Sir John Franklin expedition, where all 129 men died. British expedition, of course, they were poisoned by lead with their new technology of soldered tins, and all 129 men perished. So 2 boats, 9 people in the entire world attempting the passage in 1994. And this is what we faced: a very normal polar ice cap with still about 7 million square kilometers of ice at the northern cap. So we had to fight this. As you could see, no way to get through this in a small fiberglass boat, 57-foot boat like we had. Only an icebreaker could get through. And we found ourselves pinned and locked in the ice, nearly lost our vessel numerous times. We got separated from our friends on the other little French boat and barely retreated and made it out of the Arctic. So we tried every way that we could to get south into the channels, the southern channels of the Canadian islands, and we could not do it. And we had to retreat. We had to leave the Arctic. So the Northwest Passage had won again, just like it's done so many times over the centuries with explorers. So fast forward with me now to 2007, 13 years later, we left again for the Arctic, same time of year, and back we go up the west coast of Greenland. Beautiful places, lovely little places to visit, I highly suggest. You go there if you can. And this is Upernavik, the last little place to provision. We're now 400 miles north of the Arctic Circle, and then we cross Baffin Bay. Well, this time, guess what? In 2007, no ice whatsoever. The ice had completely disintegrated in Baffin Bay. So it's still cold, snowing on the boat, miserable conditions and all that, but no sea ice to contend with. We enter the Canadian archipelago of islands in Lancaster Sound. Guess what? No ice at all. We were absolutely shocked at what we were seeing, and we returned to the exact same place where we were in 1994. We crossed our very own path where we were stuck in the ice on the same day, 13 years later, that we had to retreat out of the Arctic. No ice whatsoever in the Northwest Passage. We became the first American sailboat to ever make it through the Northwest Passage east to west, the classic route, Amundsen's route, during the summer of 2007. 7,000 miles, and we never touched one piece of ice in the process. Think about that, 73 days. Roald Amundsen took 4 years and 3 years stuck in the ice. And that's the way history has gone. We can now cross the Northwest Passage. So this is what the graph looks like, and I'm not going to get into too much of the science because you guys know it, but you can see where we were in 1994. There's still this kind of normal trend in the satellite record, and all of a sudden, bam, there it goes, kind of off the chart. And in 2007 was this first year where we really saw this tipping point, this huge drop. So in my 13 years, just 13 short years of my sailing career in the Northwest Passage, 40% loss of ice to our northern polar ice cap. This is not natural. So this is the climate story that I tell, my very personal story. You all have yours, and it's very important that we share our stories. I kept going, joined another expedition, and circumnavigated the entire Americas, 28,000 miles with scientists and educators, looking and studying at this interface between these vulnerable areas that we're going to discuss here that are tied to this interface between land masses and ocean. And we're going to talk about these very threatened areas in the Arctic shortly. But I want to leave you with one quick takeaway, and these are the 3 Ps. Develop your own climate story. That's what we're doing so we can have this personal connection. That's what I always try to do. I point out the problem, share my human story. Then we have to have groups involved like Alaska Wilderness League here and many others like Audubon. Unfortunately, their representative couldn't be here today. Boots on the ground folks that are trying to protect these very threatened areas, while CCL is trying to put the important policy in place, carbon fee and dividend, so that we can have this sustainable future. So these are the 3 simple Ps that I talk about often, because there's areas like here, Barrow, Alaska, that are literally disintegrating. They're having to reinforce their shorelines, and you've all heard about Shishmaref, probably the village that's having to move ashore because their village is falling into the sea, and the first climate change refugees on Earth probably were happening in the Arctic. Now they're happening all over the world, being forced to move by drought and many changes that we're seeing everywhere. Of course, you have to have your polar bear slide in there, but mine's a little bit different because I want to show the difference between what's happening between the polar bears having to make this adaptive decision right now, however they're making it, picking up the signal between swimming far off to the ice edge or migrating back onto land masses and competing with other species for habitat. And the bowhead whale that migrates along the north coast of Alaska was almost hunted to extinction by the Yankee whaling fleets in the 19th century. Here they are from our boat on Ocean Watch. We got to see many of the bowhead whales, very, very special for us, but they're now threatened by oil and gas development along the same migratory routes that they've been traveling for thousands and thousands of years. And this is where the protection side comes in. These special places need to be protected because this is what a spill scenario looks like. You can see the different species. Here's the bowhead whale migratory route along the coast. This is also an important habitat for ringed seals, walrus, the North Slope of Alaska with caribou migration, and Leah will talk about this a little further. But this is a simulated spill scenario based on BP spill and not being able to block it. And of course, we won a big fight with Shell pulling out of the Arctic because of all of your efforts. Give yourself a round of applause, because that's the boots on the ground spirit that we have to have. That bought us all a little bit of time, but it's all still threatened by this development. Of course, the flyways that develop out of the north slope of Alaska. Look at the bird migrations and these flyways. This is why we need to protect this habitat. Of course, the caribou migration that you all know about, that's important for all of the native indigenous populations that live there also. These are from Richard Speener, who's a volunteer at AWL. And a couple quick stories, and then I'll turn it over. And this is George Devokie. As an example of one scientist who's working in the Arctic, he's an ornithologist. He's beginning his 5th decade on Little Cooper Island, a barrier island off the north shore of Alaska. And he's been studying a little bird called the black guillemot, all alone on this island, 1 by 3 miles, highest point 3 feet. He used to store his food there, his summer food. He'd dig down to the permafrost and then use that for natural refrigeration. Now he digs down and he hits only water. The permafrost is gone and his island is being torn apart also. He lives in this little shack. He used to live in the tent, and he had to move in there because it's bear-proof, because now bears are swimming to the island. He had never seen any bears there for 28 years until they started swimming to find the ice edge. So while we were there, he told us about his black guillemot that he studies. And after 2 decades, he started picking up something, a change in the breeding cycle of the bird. All of a sudden, he noticed that the breeding length of the season was being extended by 5 days per decade. And he didn't know what that signal was they were picking up that he wasn't tuned into. So he started researching this, and what he found was that the snow and ice was melting and receding from the north coast Alaska 5 days earlier per decade. It exactly matched the same thing that the black guillemot was doing, a 5-day longer breeding cycle. So this is now lengthened by almost a month just in his 4 decades of study. This is what he just posted on his Friends of Cooper Island blog. You can now see, just like other graphs, it has now fallen off the graph. The earliest snow melt ever recorded along the disappearance of ice in Barrow, Alaska. So same cycle that we all know, but put this in your list of tools to tell this story and share this story. Hunting and fishing communities. This cycle has been going on with Inuit hunter and fishermen for years and years, and this is my friend Wayne Thrasher. He had just harvested a beluga whale and his catch of whitefish for the season, and he was making a little bucket of bipsy, and then he was going down to store it in this permafrost ice cave that the community uses in Tuktoyaktuk. So they have 19 rooms here. This is literally sort of under the Arctic Ocean. This is a group of rooms where traditionally they've stored their food. Now, many of these permafrost ice caves are now thawing along this north coast of Alaska. So the native communities are being affected in many, many ways. And he shared some of these oral histories with me from these places along the north coast there and Tuktoyaktuk. And of course, tourism. The first cruise ship is going to go through the Northwest Passage this summer. So imagine a couple thousand people with all of the Western ways showing up in these native communities, which are dry. There's no drinking in the Canadian Arctic. So they're going to show up and demand amenities and maybe bring some things into these communities that don't belong, again, pressurizing these communities that are already endangered in so many ways. So these are the things that I ponder and think about and study as I sail the world oceans. And I'm glad to share these things with you today, and I hope that you'll have some fun questions following. Thank you very much.
Let's get Leah set up. Want to do the honors? I'm good at this.
Oh, sure. And I'm happy to introduce one of my partners here, Leah Donahue, who's involved with the Alaska Wilderness League. This group, small staff, works so hard. They're out lobbying the same offices that CCL is lobbying, And they're out there protecting much of the sensitive habitat, working hard to do so. And I'll turn it over to Leah, and she can introduce some of her staff that's here also. Thank you.
Could one of you help me get the map up? Thank you very much for having Alaska Wilderness League here today. We are amazed by what citizen climate lobby people do all across the country and feel lucky just to be a part of this day and a part of the movement that all of you contribute to. We have a lobby week ourselves once a year, and just to know that thousands of people are here talking to members of Congress makes so much more of a difference than when lobbyists do it every day, because they need to hear from their constituents about why they need to enact change. And so just thank you for everything that you do. I don't have a presentation because I found out I was speaking just a few hours ago. So bear with me, but I want to just share some exciting things that to follow up on what David was talking about. I've been with Alaska Wilderness League for about 6 years. I want to introduce a few of my colleagues who are here as well. Gwen Dobbs, who runs our communications work. She's been with the League for a long time. And Kelsey Rudolph, who helps out on the campaign. We have a staff of about 20 people, several staff in Alaska, and several staff throughout the country, because like you, we need people across the country to be advocating for Alaska's lands and waters. And most people don't know that we are an Arctic country, and these are our public lands just as much as they are Alaska public lands. And our organization was founded about 20 years ago to advocate for an area called the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It is a small area that has been fought over in Congress for the last 30 years. It's an area that some Alaska politicians would like to drill, but it's an area that is vibrant with wildlife, and we feel any type of oil drilling in that area could have a dramatic effect. When Alaska became a state, the building of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline has had a dramatic effect on the people for decades now. Some of the communities that live very close to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline have enormous rates of cancer and many other public health impacts from the flaring that happens, from the drilling that happens. And it's the people's story just as much as it is the wildlife that we want to protect that I think is very important to share. We have people from Alaska that come here several times a year from the Arctic. It takes them 3 days and thousands of dollars to travel down to DC. And when they speak because they're really fighting for future generations. Some of the communities that have been there for 5,000, 10,000 years, and they're seeing their traditional lifestyle evaporate. And so we actually had a group that was here a few weeks ago. They marched across DC, the community of Point Lay, which you can see on the map, not very well, is in the middle of this green area, and they really feel like they're fighting for their future. All these communities, as David said, are seeing the impacts, permafrost melting into the ocean. And so the campaign that we wage in the Arctic is to stop future development, because we do not feel that continuing to develop these resources, oil and gas, is really going to transition Alaska to a place where they're not dependent on oil infrastructure for thousands of years. And a lot of the people I've met look at this as a climate fight. They tell their climate story because they're living it day in and day out. And so the communities come down here, and fortunately, there have been people that have been fighting offshore drilling for a long time, and David mentioned Shell pulled out last year. It was a huge victory. It was a victory for the people, it was a victory for our climate, and that happened after the Bush administration sold millions of acres in the Arctic Ocean for drilling. And I'm really happy and excited to say that all the oil companies have actually relinquished their leases. That happened in the last few weeks in the Chukchi Sea. It's a huge, huge win. Thank you. Yeah, and a lot of that came from the public pressure that people have continued to wage for a very long time. We are hoping that the Obama administration will take it a step further and not just not offer more drilling to companies, but also protect areas. And they've already started to do that. In 2015, they withdrew from future drilling 9.8 million acres, mainly in the Chukchi Sea. And what this map identifies are very important ecological areas. They're close to 30 million acres that the Obama administration could permanently protect. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of these areas. The green area and yellow area you see is an area that is very important for the bowhead whale that David mentioned. And the bowhead whale is the lifeblood of the people of this part of the Arctic. They hunt, subsist off of it, and the populations have come back tremendously because of the ability for subsistence to continue, but also we're not allowing whalers to take away this population. It is still an endangered species, but this green and yellow area is the areas, thousands of them migrate through this area every year. The red area above it is an area known as Hannah Shoal. It's a very important area for walrus. You might have seen images of walrus haulouts on shore in the Arctic. Thousands of walrus are coming ashore because with the ice receding, they don't have as many places to forage out in the water. But this area in particular is a very important area for walrus, and this is where Shell was planning to drill last year. So the fact that Shell has pulled out gives, hopefully, the president an opportunity to protect this area. In addition to that, the yellow area is an area known as Barrow Canyons. It's if you can believe it, there's coral reefs in this area. We've learned a lot about what's here in a very short period of time. But belugas, thousands of belugas, and I've flown over Cassie Gaelic Lagoon. We just learned that we were mispronouncing that for a very long time, so I'm now saying it a little differently. But thousands of belugas swim in this area, along with the ring seals that David mentioned. On the Beaufort side, these nearshore areas are critical for polar bears, for walrus, for seals, and lots of whales migrate. There's an area, the area in the blue is known as Camden Bay. It's very important for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge ecosystem. So those are just some of the areas that we're looking and hoping that the president will take it a step further and protect them so we can make sure that some areas that are really some of the most important areas in the Arctic are protected long term. I'd be happy to take questions, but thank you again for all your advocacy. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Leah. Just one quick question. Are there things that people can do to encourage the president to take that action?
Of course. So the president, the Obama administration is going through a process right now. Every 5 years, they have to evaluate what areas to allow drilling for oil and gas development. A comment period just ended on Thursday of last week, on June 16th. They had a draft proposed program that would allow more oil and gas development in both the Chukchi and the Beaufort Sea, but they also asked for information about what areas to protect. So that plan will be finalized most likely right after the election. It takes them several months to take all the public feedback, but I would say anyone that wants to push back about future drilling in the Arctic, this is a great opportunity to do it before their final plan comes out. Many members of Congress actually just signed letters asking for the president to withdraw the Arctic from all future oil and gas development. About 100 members of Congress just took that action. So and 400 scientists also sent in a recent letter asking for the president to do this. So anybody should definitely reach out to President Obama, send a letter, make a call. That is really the most important action you can take to ask him to protect these areas long term.
Thanks, Leah. Just one more phone call, one more letter. What the heck? You can do it, right? Our next speaker is Sean Powers. Come on up, Sean. It's one thing to recognize the need to take care of these vulnerable places and populations, but you know what? It's going to cost a lot. So where's that going to come from? And keep that in mind while we listen to the incredible work that ERI is doing.
Yeah, I think I can figure, but okay. Can you all hear me okay, or do I need to move this up a little bit? All right. How about now? Are we coming through? Okay. Now I've just got to find the presentation here so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so thank you guys very much for having me. I gotta say, just in my own work, it's been a rough couple weeks, stuck behind a desk, researching and writing and staring at screens. And it's quite an inspiration, actually, to see volunteers who are out here, as David said, boots on the ground, who are really, sort of doing the groundwork and laying the sort of real activism that needs to get done, which sometimes us lawyers who are sitting in an office can lose sight of. At Earthrights, and I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to sort of how we started. We try not to lose sight of the community aspect and the campaigner aspect. So I just want to say, to begin with, thank you to all of you guys. I'm also somewhat mindful of time and that we want to leave open some questions, so I'm going to try and go fairly quickly through this presentation. And Howard sort of touched on two words that I kind of want to, is the thrust of what I'm hoping to speak to you guys about, which is climate accountability. And so I think the place for me to start there is with Earthright's origin story. So 20-some years ago, a second-year law student from the University of Virginia was working in refugee camps in Thailand. She was doing good work there, an ambitious, inspired young radical lawyer, and she met a Burmese activist who goes by Kasawa. And Kasawa said to Katie, the law student, there's something you have to see. And he took her to the Yadna pipeline, which was an oil pipeline being built through Burma from the Andaman Sea to pump oil into Thailand. Now, this pipeline was owned and operated by a consortium of companies, Chevron, or Unocal, which is now a part of Chevron, and Total, the French company. It's really hard, I think, for us to understand and for me to understand as someone who's grown up in the United States exactly what happened to the communities that lived on this pipeline and were forced to work for this pipeline. But the most grotesque human rights abuses that you could imagine is what these communities experienced. Forced labor, rape, murder of children, of women, of villagers. And what Kasawa and Katie decided is that this shouldn't be allowed to happen, that American corporations should be held liable for human rights abuses, no matter if they're doing it in the United States or if they're doing it in other parts of the world. That's just what justice requires. Now, I think for a lot of us, there's an intuitive sense that, of course, right, if you fund murder, if you fund rape, you should be responsible for it. But I can tell you that that wasn't always the case. And so the litigation that they started, which was the Unocal case, was the first example of a US corporation being held liable for human rights abuses committed outside of the United States. And everyone told them that they were crazy. Everyone told them that the law doesn't provide for this, but they found a way to make it work. And I think this is the parallel I see with climate change. Everyone tells us that accountability for climate change is a fool's errand, that it's crazy, and that it can't work. But I think what I'd like to sort of explain or sort of give a preview for in this presentation is that climate accountability can work, and in a lot of ways it has to work. Because what we're dealing with right now are uncompensated losses. It doesn't matter what happens, and let me see if I can move along. Nope. Hopefully. There we go. So what is happening? That it does not matter if we reduce emissions to zero today. There is enough carbon in the atmosphere that will have persistent warming into the future. This is going to create impacts on communities that are unavoidable, and these are uncompensated losses. The homeowner that has to raise his house because of flood levels, the farmer that has to dig a deeper well because there's no more water because of drought, the city that has to spend $20 billion, as is the case with New York, to retrofit and upgrade its infrastructure to make way for climate change. These are expenses that are being borne by individuals and communities today that are uncompensated. And the point about climate accountability and potentially climate accountability litigation is that these losses should not be borne by the innocent. They should be borne by the people who created them. So I'm going to move through some of the facts that you already know, I think, about what climate change means quite speedily, because I have no doubt that as climate activists, much of this is not new to you, but there is a dramatic human element that will be experienced as the climate changes. Up to 600 million people being displaced, health and sanitation, disease spread, resource decline, and property damage. I think one of the other pieces that I think is important as campaigners and activists and lawyers, and for all of you that are going out there to message on this, is to realize that climate change is a near universal problem. There are certainly communities in Alaska that will bear it first, and they may bear it harshest, but that climate change will affect almost every community in the United States and around the world in some way, in some fashion. I feel pressed for time, but I do think that we should at least go quickly over some of these examples because they're depressing, and that's what I want to leave you with, is a real sense of sadness and despair, because that's what motivates. But so, as Harold said, I had some time to work. I worked for a time in Southeast Asia, and this is one of the, and I think, usually there's only one ground zero, but I think with climate change we have many. And the Mekong Delta is certainly one of those ground zeros. So much of the land is at or below sea level. Much of the population is vulnerable in terms of food supply. And by 2030, it's estimated that 69% of the Mekong Delta will be flooded. Now, this will be a devastating human impact. Rice production in the Delta will be crippled because of saltwater inundation, and up to 1 million people may be displaced by 2050. I'd also be remiss if we didn't say that, these sort of catastrophic impacts that we're seeing in places, Pacific Islands, in Asia, and in the Delta are not happening in the United States as well. The Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana and the Mississippi Delta is now what, I'm sure most of you saw the story that came out as, quote unquote, America's first climate refugees. They had to resettle an entire community, and I know this is what we're going to see. I trust you've all seen the pictures of Shishmaref and of Kivalina, absolutely devastating. And I think, when you guys are lobbying Congress, it's important, I think we all feel intuitively the human connection of, seeing people, but sometimes you need to put dollar amounts to get through to legislators. This is costing the federal government money, $48 million to relocate the community. There's also a budget proposal, I believe, for Kivalina that's in the degrees of magnitude larger than that. I believe $500 million. This is, again, to think about it as an uncompensated loss. This is being borne by taxpayers and by communities, by you and I. Again, I spoke briefly already about New York City and the $20 billion price tag that they face. But the more important thing, which is what I was hoping to talk to, is why is this happening? And I think this is the crux of the corporate accountability piece to this. And I think that it is largely an undiscussed part of it. That I think when we all think about climate change, it does seem so historic and so large that there can be a tendency to believe that there's not responsible parties, right? That we're all sort of equally responsible. We all drive a car, we all get in an airplane, we all consume fossil fuels. And there's some truth in that, right? We all have to adjust our behaviors in the future. But looking backward, which is one of the points of climate accountability, I think we'll see a very different picture. So the Climate Accountability Institute, and through the work of a man named Richard Heede, put out a report in late 2013 called the Carbon Majors Report. I really recommend this to everyone who's interested in climate accountability and climate change more generally. It's a peer-reviewed study. It can be dense, as most of those things are, but the takeaways, I think, are stark and clear. Richard Heede and the Climate Accountability Institute tabulated all carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution, starting about 1750, and found that 63% of those emissions can be traced to just 90 entities. And I don't think you would be surprised to see the names that are on that list. Chevron and its predecessors, including Texaco, are responsible for 3.5% of all carbon emissions since 1750. ExxonMobil, 3.2%, BP, 2.5%, and Shell, 2%. I'd also remark, and I think it's hard to ignore this when you're talking about uncompensated losses, to see how that those companies have compensated themselves through the sale and production of fossil fuels. In the decade before 2012, the top 5 oil and gas companies made profits of more than $1 trillion. So just to compare that, the $48 million that we're federal government and us as taxpayers are responsible for versus the $1 trillion that they've made in profits for shareholders. There seems something slightly unjust about that. I think the production, though, and the production and sale of fossil fuels is only one piece of this. The other piece, which I think is what makes them culpable, is that they knew better, but they did worse. And it's not in my slides right now, but I would recommend to you a website and a study that was put out by CCL, which is the Center for International Environmental Law. It's called the Smoke and Fumes Report, I believe, but if you put CL and smoke and fumes, something will come up. And it goes back even further to the 1950s, because Exxon and Mobil, which is now Exxon, was at the front of climate science. It was necessary for their operations to understand meteorology and weather patterns, and so they were investing money in good science to figure out what the connection between carbon and the climate and the weather was, as early as the 1950s. Now, some of this might have been equivocal as the science was developing in the 1950s and 60s, but what's clear is by the time we reached the 1970s and the early 80s, they knew about the consequences of fossil fuel production, they knew about the imperative to change our energy sources, and they did not do a thing about it. So in 1978, and I find this quote to be damning, an internal Exxon memo reads, "Man has a time window of 5 to 10 years before the need for hard decisions regarding changes in energy strategies might become critical." I think that just speaks for itself. Because what did we see from Exxon in the 1980s and 90s, in the 2000s? Did we see them assisting us with the hard decisions about our energy policies? I didn't see it. I saw denialism. I saw funding skepticism about climate change. I also see them attacking activists. I see them calling for investigations of the New York Attorney General in order to inquire about, whether they're conspiring to restrict Exxon's First Amendment rights to tell us that climate change might not be happening. This doesn't seem like the same reasonable actions you'd expect from someone who said in 1978 that we have a 5 to 10 year window to act. The timing, I think, also, when you're talking about accountability and you're talking about lawsuits, and I'm happy to bore anyone with, the ins and outs of a tort lawsuit, but I think when you match it with a graph that shows carbon production and you put that at the timing of those memos, 1978 and 1980, you see an exponential increase in carbon production. They doubled down. They didn't do what one would expect if you thought you had a 5 to 10 year window. You didn't do what one would expect if you saw that there would be a 3-degree increase in temperature if we doubled CO2 from the pre-industrial average. And so we get to climate accountability. Tort law, generally speaking, is about allocating losses. Who bears the consequence of an injury? 10 minutes, okay. All right. I think we're running down with time. So the question, I think, we can talk about it, but I hope it is obvious that there is a basis for a climate accountability lawsuit here. Who it will be on behalf of, what court it will be litigated against, who will be the defendants, these are all questions. But I think that there is a just case that communities in Alaska, communities in Florida, communities in New York City should not have to bear the consequences of a fossil fuel economy that was peddled to us by companies that knew better and who made trillions of dollars off that economy and off that decision. So I would end just with a basic quote from John Holdren, who I believe was an advisor to President Obama, who said, "We basically have 3 choices: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We're going to do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be. The more mitigation we do, the less adaptation will be required, and the less suffering there will be." I think this is one of the most perfect encapsulations I've heard about the present moment. And the question is what we do in this moment. Well, we say adaptation should not be borne by communities. Mitigation is going to come only when we have a private sector and energy companies that are willing to help us adapt our energy sector. And so we're here with you guys and with everyone that's going to try and change that debate. And one piece of a climate accountability lawsuit might be helping for those companies who are disinclined to mitigate and who are inclined to keep producing and selling oil to realize that there will be a price tag on that. If they are on the hook for New York City's $20 billion resiliency plan, if they're on the hook to relocate a community, maybe they'll be a little bit more amenable to the political process. So thank you very much. I'm inspired by the work you guys do, and happy to answer any questions you have.
And just go.
We're all set.
Nicely done.
Thank you.
Great. Well, while the cards are going around, we might as well catch a couple questions if somebody's ready. Okay, right here in front.
It's easy to understand the national dimensions of this climate justice, but how do we adjudicate the international issues when the problem was developed in the industrialized nations, but the brunt of the impact is in the third world?
That's a phenomenal question. I think there's a complicated answer to it, unfortunately. One, I think you are seeing legal efforts from communities around the world to bring cases. So there's a Peruvian farmer who's brought a case against a large German emitter in German courts out of that company's contributions to climate change. I think you will see a pattern of that. And an increase of accountability measures that way. You also see the Philippines Human Rights Commission, for example, has taken on an investigation. I think that there's a question when you're considering what the first step in getting U.S. courts and U.S. policymakers to embrace accountability and justice for communities abroad. And I do think that's where the timing comes in. One of the things that we are very interested in as we pursue our accountability strategy is to make sure that American legislators and American courts don't just see this as an international problem, but see this as an American problem as well. But I have no doubt, and we have been an international human rights organization for 20 years. There is a hostility, undeniably, in U.S. courts to vindicating international human rights norms and human rights violations outside the United States in U.S. courts. We continue to do it and find ways to do it, but I think there is a strategic question about timing. Sorry.
Here I have a question for Sean again. What are the basic legal theories and principles on which climate accountability could be based?
That's a great question. I am going to answer in a hypothetical or a theoretical version because ERI is considering, but has not yet filed a climate accountability lawsuit. I'm somewhat nervous about giving away too much legal strategy, but I will say that there was a series of cases that were brought in federal court in 5-6 years ago, and the theories were negligence, nuisance, common law tort theories. Those cases were unsuccessful for reasons that aren't worth belaboring here, but they have not closed the door to climate accountability litigation by any means. There are efforts, and there have been some thought about products liability and unjust enrichment, as well as consumer fraud. So there are as many theories as there are creative lawyers to address this, which might mean not that many because most lawyers aren't that creative. Myself excluded from.
You want to read the question?
Sure, it's a great question. Speak about citizen involvement. Kayaktivists rocked, summer of 2015, all over the country, social media rocked. Well, agreed, 100%. The kayaktivists, we call it the kayaktivist movement. There are many organizations and people in Seattle that brought kayaktivism to the rest of the country. I have to give a big shout out to Greenpeace, who really brought the movement along with many other groups in Seattle. And if you're unfamiliar, what happened in Seattle is Shell's rigs were headed to Seattle. They were headed to the port, and the people stood up and said, "You are not bringing those rigs to our port. We are not going to promote drilling in the Arctic." And that just created a movement across the country. And last July, we had kayaktivist events on July 18th in 20 cities across the country simultaneously, including in Washington, D.C. at the White House. And it was a real movement builder, and I think other climate-related issues have used the kayak as a symbol. And I'm sure David could actually talk a little bit more about the kayak, but the kayak was actually a term that came out of the Inupiat people of the Arctic, and so it's incredible that it was a symbol to protect the Arctic. But we had millions of people from all over the country that have engaged to stop drilling in the Arctic Ocean. In fact, last week, when the comment period ended, 1.4 million people took action calling for no offshore drilling in the Arctic. So the movement and the media and everything that everyone has put into stopping drilling in many parts of the country, but especially in the Arctic, was unbelievable. And Shell would have not pulled out, in my opinion, if they didn't have the public pressure. So thanks for the question.
This will be our last question because we're at time, so I'm going to answer it myself. How could CCL help get the word out on climate change in the Arctic? And should there be a CCL Arctic action team? This is one of our little teams. So the answer to the second question is, if you think there should be a CCL action team, guess who gets to start it? Right? Somebody's waving their hand back there. It's not hard. And they can be a lot of fun, especially if you get a group of committed people to work with you. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, David, Sean, and Leah for stepping up in the very last minute. Let's go take care of those most vulnerable people and places.